Hello, and thank you again for joining us on another episode of REDI at Work, where we get to discuss racial equity, diversity, and inclusion in the context of work. Today, in particular, we will be talking about REDI in the context of academia and what are some of the trends and themes that we're seeing as it relates to education, as it relates to knowledge development. And we have no other then Dr. Malinda Smith joining us today. I'm looking forward to this conversation. Again, thank you for taking the time to be here today.
It's my pleasure to be here, and thanks for the invitation.
Dr. Malinda Smith is a political science professor and the inaugural Vice Provost, Equity, Diversity and Inclusion at the University of Calgary. She is a former Vice President, Equity Issues for the Federation for the Humanities and Social Sciences, and currently serves as Chair of the Advisory Committee on Equity, Diversity, Inclusion, and Decolonization. She serves on the Statistics Canada Working Group on Black Communities in Canada, the Canada Research Chair's Advisory Committee on Equity, Diversity and Inclusion Policy, and the Interinstitutional Advisory Committee for National Dialogues and Action for Inclusive Higher Education and Communities. Dr. Smith has published widely in areas of international and comparative politics and equity, diversity, and human rights. Of course, it just makes sense that we're having you share with us on this journey around racial equity, diversity, and inclusion over at the Inclusion Project, which is how we support stakeholders across different sectors, public, private, on issues of advancing and furthering equity within the context of work. Do you just want to take us through some highlights in the course of your career so far?
Well, I would say this, that, so I'm an Edmontonian. When I migrated to Canada, I moved to Alberta, and where I did my PhD at University of Alberta in political science, international relations, comparative politics. I also taught critical race theory, gender and politics. And I also taught at Athabasca University, where I created a program in political economy and also in governance, law, and management. But and now I'm at University of Calgary. And over the course of that 30-year span, I've spent a lot of time actually working on equity, diversity, inclusion issues, and more recently have stressed the need to think about the D, which is the role of decolonization in this process. But I started with equity as in the student experience, thinking about it in terms of precariat workers, the lecturers, and then also issues around gender equity. I was the president of the Academic Women's Association at the University of Alberta, where I spearheaded the diversity gap research that I continue here at Calgary. Then I shifted to more discussion around leadership and the role of leadership diversity in spearheading these changes. Because I was trying to figure out what accounts for the fact that over 30 years of employment equity in Canada, we have seen so little progress, so little movement, especially for racialized and Indigenous peoples. And certainly disabilities often aren't on the table. So what accounts for this? What explains this gap? And part of it, of course, is a data gap, but a part of it's a knowledge gap. And just part of it is that, in fact, they have not been a part of the discourse and the practices around employment equity. So we have to disaggregate that language and what it has meant in the last 30 years. And we will see that racial equity was not a part of the program of action to ameliorate equity in universities, corporate boards, nonprofit sector, or even government. And the racial reckoning that we had in 2020 has highlighted more than ever the need for racial equity. And the pandemic, COVID-19, has even amplified that further, the importance of racial equity, in particular racial equity data.
what are some of the kinds of data that are coming out from groups that maybe equity-seeking groups that have historically been marginalized, maybe in particular racialized groups, indigenous Black groups? What are some of the specific data saying about these groups?
Okay, so the racial reckoning highlighted, for example, the experiences with police and police violence. So racial profiling, carding, stop and frisk, they call it in the US. This disproportionately impacted Black and Indigenous peoples. As disadvantages they experience in the criminal justice system, disproportionate sentencing, disproportionate incarceration, but in the school system, K to 12, the experiences of disproportionate punishment, suspensions, and data that some argue highlights the school to prison pipeline or the cradle to the grave pipeline, which is to say that the negative experiences, the disproportionate negative experiences, the tyranny of low expectations, have marginalized and pushed Black and Indigenous people, pushed them out of the school, not drop out, but pushed out, not underachievement, but actually underfunding, the funding gap. So that's one set of data that predated the pandemic. But the racial reckoning highlighted also the disproportionate deaths at the hand of the police. And cases like Joyce Eshawin, or more recently, the case in Quebec around the Black woman, Cameroonian refugee, a woman who was taped herself on the hospital bed, highlighted the role of institutions. So police is supposed to be protective services. The hospitals are supposed to be healthcare and well-being. And here you see a disproportionately negative experience, which highlighted the need then of the criminal justice system, the police, the hospitals. You can also find some of the experiences with accommodations and service experiences of people being followed around in stores. This all highlights systemic racism, structural inequities that go beyond the individual and into personal examples that people use, but also the growth of hate groups and far-right groups and the ways in which they openly and publicly attack racialized and Indigenous peoples raises questions about how deep our commitment to anti-racism is. So anti-racism is one key component. Addressing racism is a key component of actually trying to achieve racial equity, because you cannot achieve racial equity as long as racism persists and remains uncontested. So that's why you see cities like City of Calgary, City of Edmonton, but cities across Toronto, all developing anti-racism committees, anti-racism policies and strategies, with the aim of removing that as a barrier, an obstacle to hiring, to promotion, and to leadership positions.
In 2019, before the world knew what the word pandemic meant, the World Economic Forum had projected that it would take us, at the rate that we're going, it would take us about 108 years to close the gender gap. I'm really curious to know now in 2021, how much further that gap has widened, because it feels very much like with the pandemic coming on, we've lost some of the traction. And what's really quite sad is we're now seeing even the intersections, especially with race. If it's gonna take 109 years to close the gender gap, I wonder how long it will take to close the race gap. And we as a society are just even at the beginning phases.
Yeah. So prior to the pandemic, the book that I'm a co-author on, The Equity Myth, highlighted some gaps, the racialized and Indigenous peoples. But you also had COUT, Canadian Association of Universities, teachers. Their 2018 report, underrepresented, underpaid. Okay, and so for example, Black scholars were 2%, but racialized minorities were significantly, there was a kind of a racialized pecking order, and some groups were significantly underrepresented. And then Universities Canada came out with its report in 2019 on equity, which highlighted again the significant underrepresentation of racialized minorities and Indigenous peoples in leadership, significantly underrepresented. In the professoriate, especially at the full professor level, and it was a dramatic difference between the student body and the larger population, which were much more diverse. Now, some people may say, oh, they're not available. And so just to be clear, I want to stress, the Statistics Canada data suggests in terms of PhDs, MDs, or veterinarian degrees, it's not a question of qualification. The obstacles are not a question of availability. The obstacles lie somewhere else. They can't get their foot in the door. So we need to deal with those racial barriers and obstacles. So if that was the case pre-pandemic, some of the research that has come out in terms of the impact of COVID-19, yes, some people are actually excelling during the pandemic. Single men, for example, some of them, the research suggests some of them are being more productive. They're just publishing. Whereas some recent research that came out in the conversation by Jennifer Davis at University of British Columbia, where she surveyed people across the post-secondary sector, found that women and racialized people were, their careers were being hampered. Statistics Canada also came up with various surveys on the impact and showed that there was a disproportionate impact not only on racialized and Indigenous students, but also staff and faculty. Okay, so all along the pathway and the pipeline, the academic pipeline, you see very racialized and Indigenous people being hampered. The dilemma we face is there wasn't a racial equity lens or policy or strategy pre-pandemic. And I think I've seen during the pandemic, there has been a tendency to revert back to the default, which was gender equity. So we're seeing a lot of analyses around the gender equity gap. What we aren't seeing, though, is comparable analyses around the implications for people who are racialized, and yet StatsCan says that people who are Black and who are sort of Asian and Chinese have had a disproportionate impact. People who are Filipino, not just because they're frontline workers, but sometimes they live in multi-generational homes, and also in terms of where some of them work in, say, whether they work in warehouses or meatpacking plants, or if they work in the hospitals or on public transportation, or they use public transportation. A disproportionate impact in terms of getting COVID-19, but also dying from COVID-19. So that combination of the broader political economy, the labor force, the impact on the labor force, the impact on income, decline in income, decline in employment, that's going to impact the children of those families who can, so access to universities and to workplace, who can afford to go to universities. So whether our entrances will be designed or redesigned to provide greater access for racialized and Indigenous peoples is a question. But also what kind of policies and strategy we're putting in place to close the gap. So for example, Stanford decided they were going to implement an initiative for all untenured faculty where they would be able to get a term off at any time between now and tenure and promotion application to try to close, to reignite their research agendas because of the disproportionate impact of COVID-19. So, I mean, you can think of the students and staff who were working remotely in the North, where they have a digital divide. You can think about international students who are working in different time zones. So our time zone here in Canada, whether it's Eastern Standard or Mountain Standard or Pacific, that's Excel. It could be 7, 8, 12 hours difference for the students. That means we are teaching in the afternoon or in the morning. It's their late evening, which means if they have a small house or anything, the family rest is impacted. So there's all kinds of impact of COVID-19 on institutions, especially the university sector, that we will be dealing with in the years to come. And I think unless we are clear about the need for racial equity lens, the gap will widen rather than close.
And part of the gaps we're seeing still, and that's been long term, is how faculty very often does not reflect the community of students that they serve. And that's part of the disproportionate representation that we're seeing. And we're hoping that, that's something that starts to shift.
So one thing universities haven't done, have resisted inexplicably, given the gold standard arguments made by Stats Canada and elsewhere for the need for disaggregated data, is they've resisted collecting the data. And I think it's worth thinking about the need for data literacy, EDI data literacy, for people who are responsible, who are data stewards, who are trying to protect the data and the people's privacy, but also then don't see why the EDI case requires a different kind of lens, because you're trying to close gaps, and you cannot close the gaps if you don't have the knowledge. So data, EDI data leads to knowledge about the gaps that can allow you to develop the strategies to close them. You're not going to get to step one unless you do that. But the other thing, so there's this kind of knowledge gap around data and data literacy, EDI data literacy. The second kind of gap, though, is around leadership literacy around EDI. So for the longest time, leaders only needed to know gender equity, and that was gender in the terms of binary, right? So women, men, male, female, and now you have to ask yourself the question: how is it 30 years on of employment equity on? Only now people are learning the language. Only writing statements now about anti-racism, only now listening and learning. They're going on, so universities are going on these exercises where they're listening and learning. So great that they're writing statements against anti-racism. Hopefully they see that these are internalized and not just a performative gesture. So great that they're listening and learning to their Black faculty and racialized faculty and Indigenous faculty, staff, and student. Great. What's necessary though, and not just a one-off initiative like an advisor here that's underfunded, under-resourced, but also a strategy. Another short-term 1-year strategy or 2-year strategy, a long-term strategy for ensuring that the university sector, the college sector, the CEGEPs reflect the diversity of the Canadian population and the student body. That means some really difficult conversations about racism and discrimination, about the myth of color blindness or non-racism or non-racialism, and about the need to what it means to be anti-racist, not just non-racist or colorblind. And so that difficult conversation, unfortunately, there's a demand that it be led by racialized Indigenous people, the very ones who are most vulnerable and marginalized. So it's highlighting systemic issues again about about the majority's need to be much more accountable and to be much more engaged, whether it's as allies or they see themselves as complicit in maintaining the current prevailing order. So inequities are not going to be ameliorated unless we actually start to have those difficult conversations, but not just in to the preaching to the choir as it goes, but actually where it matters. And we actually need leaders at the senior level, the level of the presidents, level of the vice presidents and provosts and deans, spearheading this
Mhm.
charge. And I'm beginning to see some of that. It's
Mhm.
not across the board, but
Mhm.
we are seeing some leadership, and we actually need to see more. So we need to encourage leaders to have the courage of their convictions, to go
Right.
beyond the statements to practice. And
Right.
so my view is that's going to be needed now more than ever in any kind of building back equitably post-COVID.
Knowing that a lot of institutions are just at the early stages, knowing that there's got to be a reckoning, there's got to be a reflection and auditing and assessment and all of that. How do we, what's the scoring table that we bring ourselves to? How do we benchmark progress as we move along?
Well, I mean, so most of, like I said, most of the discussions, we are still even at early stages of representational or compositional diversity. What I call that's like 101, right? Who's in the room. The second thing though is the question about what's the experience when they're in the room. So that's qualitative data. And so that can mean everything from hiring. It could mean everything from retention. It could mean everything from promotion. It could mean looking at this workforce data, staff, postdoc, faculty, leadership, compositional. It's evidence-based decision making. So what are the gaps? What are the areas for urgent action to close those gaps? What are the metrics for progress? But it's also, once you're there, it's questions about retention. It's questions about promotion and leadership. Um, we could ask questions about stages in the progress. For example, you get in, but do you get blocked? So how do you move from hiring to tenure and promotion, from promotion to full professor, for example? How do you
Mhm.
move from entry to, say, a dean and so on? So we need
Mhm.
data by stages. Who are the new hires? Because
Mhm.
that's the socialization and the reproduction of the academy. If the new hires aren't diverse, 5, 10, 15 years down the line, that's going to be our compositional of the universities. So
Mhm.
and then where are we recruiting from? Do we still have this mythology of Ivy League? Which schools do we go to? Do we go to the poorer areas, the lower income areas, or
Mhm.
are we only going to elite schools? Um, that also shapes, again, not just the demographics of institutions, universities, corporations, nonprofit sector. It shapes the broader social fabric, the broader
Mhm.
community.
Mhm.
So there's an intersection here between the university community experiences.
Mhm.
So there are all kinds of data that we can be collecting, but again, I keep repeating, the basic compositional representational diversity data are important alongside the qualitative data where we have to do assessments about how do you assess the experiences
Mhm.
how do you, of people when they're there, the
Mhm.
focus groups, the kind of more experiential data that we do less often. Um, and as important as collecting all this data, analyzing it, finding the gaps, is data transparency. And I think and going beyond just compliance to actually thinking about um, the benefits of this, what we know from having a more diverse workforce in terms of and having a more a better experiences, which is to say, people they come to the recidivism or their absenteeism is
Mhm.
less. We've not recidivism, the absenteeism is less. They perform better. They're more productive. Um, the companies are more profitable. I think decision making tables are better. So the advantages I don't think we have been able to capitalize on we haven't even been able to build on
Mm-hmm.
the value and the benefit of diversity for who we are, but also for our knowledges, for our ways of thinking and being. And so that needs to be cultivated. That's why inclusion is not just automatic, it's actually a skill. And so that the deficit of that skill is actually injurious for the post-COVID building back more equitably world. And so again, it's something that we need to be cultivating now, and we need to be accountable for now and monitoring very closely now. And data will be key
Mm-hmm.
to any kind of uh, future imaginary that's better and more equitable.
That is awesome. I couldn't have asked for a more robust, rounded perspective on this subject of REDI in the context of academia, in the context of research, in the context of post-secondary institutions. Thank you for everything that you've brought today. This has been a most meaningful conversation.
Thank you
Very.
very much for having me, and it's been a pleasure speaking with you.
Thank you. Thank you.